Last month, on a cesspool which shall not be named, a recently discovered 1879 letter by Karl Marx himself was circulated. It confirmed that Marx predicted the Russian Revolution, something he only teased in the past. It also reaffirmed his lifelong support of internationalism. This is of course of no shock to any Marxist with half a brain, as they were the logical conclusions of his materialism. It is a bastardization of this materialism which so often leads to a rejection of his internationalism in favor of a national, and therefore middle-class, flavor of socialism. Bastardization leads renegades to ignore greater material trends in favor of servile faith which proposes great men, through speeches and policy alone, were able to influence an entire mode of production, and thus determine the course of a revolution. The reality is that the framework such men worked with was rigged, and proved to be but another tool of historical development, one which raises a country to the capitalist mode of production, rather than, as leftists claim, establishing the AES their Brezhnevite asses love. Their shortcomings are rooted in the very nature of their isolated struggle, and further supports the internationalist approach demonstrated in the 1879 letter, for without the aid of the international proletariats, red peripheral revolutions are bound to fail. What exactly do we mean by that? Bound to fail. Such a preposterous statement needs some clarification. Many of these revolutionary states have shown to be quite prosperous in the face of global economic exclusion. Their centrally planned production of commodities is efficient. It has lifted millions out of poverty. It has shown to be more productive, in fact, than many free market societies. These countries have obviously not failed to produce wealth. To say so would be absurd, but all of the achievements commonly linked to socialism in these countries are directly caused by the unrivaled ability for capital to expand. If its expansion was the goal of these revolutions, they were largely successful. They cannot, however, be said to have succeeded in the goal of communism, the abolition of the current state of things, as without adequate productive capabilities, commodity production is impossible to do away with. It's as Marx stated in the German ideology.
This development of productive forces is an absolutely necessary practical premise, because without it, want is merely made general, and with destitution, the struggle for necessities and all the old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced.
In other words, lack of industry will inevitably bring with it poverty and destitution, and commodity production will necessarily be reinstituted. This has perhaps been no better exemplified than with the Bolshevik Revolution. Prior to Soviet salvation, Russia was essentially poop nation. In contrast to the rest of Europe, it was antiquated. Productive forces had not been fully established, meaning bare necessities were not as readily available. This made it quite prone to unrest. Western European powers had experienced similar conditions, all of which resulted in significant regime changes which skyrocketed their economic developments. Russia had never experienced such cataclysmic class-eroding events. Due to this, a robust capitalist class had not fully developed, and the economy was largely agriculture-based. This made it a partial serfdom, with a majority peasantry dwarfing the proletariat. In the early 20th century, these conditions would lead to People's War. Before it could even breathe, the resulting bourgeois government would find itself in an imperial war, one which was beyond its industrial capabilities. In the face of this chaos, a little guy named Lenin saw an incredible opportunity to fuck shit up. The provisional government was ill-equipped for novel industrial warfare, causing the crude state machinery to falter. Shortages of basic equipment, such as boots, were common on both the war front and home. The Russian masses, who had long lost faith in the state, were forced to further rely on local organizations for services it refused to provide. This amounted to the February Revolution, which was just the beginning of the descent. A collaboration was wagered between the peasantry and the proletariat. To the further benefit of the Bolsheviks, the bourgeoisie was still weak and inexperienced, while the minority proletariat was highly advanced. Events like the July Days and their violent suppression by the government had proven to this minority that the Kerensky government was petite bourgeois and backstabbing in nature. Although unorthodox, a proletarian revolution could be waged. The window for such a revolution, however, was fleeting, and if not taken advantage of, would disappear entirely. With defeat on the horizon, peace was looming over Russia. This peace came with the potential for a united imperial front which would crush any attempt at revolution. Given this urgency, upon his arrival in Petrograd, Lenin wasted no time in denouncing the provisional government. It was then decided in the meeting of the Central Committee on the 10th of October 1917 that
the international situation is such that we must take the initiative. We now have the majority behind us. Politically, the situation is ripe for taking power.
We interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
Notice how he said international. The situation was not isolated to Russia. Capitalism was in a highly developed stage. The Great Imperialist War was just a reflection of this. As the power of the trusts grew, so too did revolutionary fervour amongst workers of the industrial core. This momentum had international character as it was felt by all in this core. The aforementioned letter by old man Marx demonstrates an understanding of this. an understanding which led to his consistent international stance on revolution. In his eyes, communist revolution was not something that could ever be completed in one country alone. He regarded this international dependency of the proletariat of one nation on the proletariat of the rest as, quote, my political line from which I have never deviated. He made it clear that if an uprising of one proletariat were to occur, it would have to rely on uprisings in neighboring countries, a line that Lenin never deviated from. Although Marx and Lenin agreed proletarian victory required the overthrowing of the industrial core, revolution did not necessarily have to begin in said core. Marx, in fact, stated in his letter that he foresaw that revolution in the explosive form will start this time not from the West, but from the East, from Russia, even predicting the necessity of a revolutionary party. He claims that it will react first on the other two grave despotisms, Austria and Germany, where a violent upheaval has become a historical necessity. This explosive form was not exempt from international dependency. Lenin was aware of this when mobilizing the Russian masses in anticipation of class conflict in Greater Europe. Revolution seemed unlikely in Britain, the most industrial advanced country in the world. It was hoped that revolution in Russia would give the proletariat in the West an example to work off. If unsuccessful as a catalyst, the Soviet experiment in proletarian rule would inevitably amount to nothing. Lenin particularly hoped for the revolution to inspire the German workers, which it ultimately did with the Spartacist uprising. The development of class consciousness was apparent in the fact that the Spartacists, Rosa and Karl's group, had very little to do with the uprising. It was the result of genuine anger felt amongst the German workers, an anger which would be felt long after the defeat of the revolutionaries. It would ultimately be thwarted by the forces of capital. The German counter-revolution was merciless, leaving the proletariat unorganized by killing its leaders, but without organization they were sporadic and quickly dealt with by the social democratic state. Workers' revolts would continue in the districts of Germany.
With the German counter-revolution in full swing, the Soviet Union was isolated and forced into a sort of defensive state. No Red Germany meant independently industrializing, as trade was not possible with imperialist powers that had just, attempted imperialism on them during the Civil War. Under these circumstances, transforming an underdeveloped agricultural society into a communist one would prove difficult. A new policy would have to be developed, perhaps one of an economic variety? As part of the new economic policy, the sale of peasant land and hiring of laborers for agricultural work became legal. Private enterprise was permitted, and peasants could sell their products on a free market. These new policies were taken advantage of by NEP men, an emerging capitalist class reluctantly allowed by the Bolsheviks until 1927. Prior to this, from 1917 to 1921, mostly during the period of war communism, the Bolsheviks attempted to facilitate exchange in natura. This meant that industries traded commodities directly for each other, without using money as a unit of account and medium for this exchange. Instead of the ruble, which was high-key unstable, commodities were measured in tons, kilos, and other units of measurement.
The changes effected in the system of our food policy made it necessary to enable the peasant to exchange his surplus for manufactured articles. The state machine, however, is not fitted to undertake this exchange with the peasant directly. The situation therefore necessitated several changes in the industrial policy of Russia as applied until now. The first change consists in the permission to trade in all non-monopolized products and in the liberty to build up industries and to sell their products in the open market. This liberty was enjoyed only by trades with less than 5 workers. Now this is done away with in the sense that no limit is set on the number of workers to be employed. The recognition of the fact that the organizing capacity of the Russian proletariat was insufficient for the communistic management of tens of thousands of small trades led to the elimination of those small industries which are not important to the community, and to the letting of these to private enterprises or companies. For the present, no estimate of the importance or number of industries thus let can be given. Judging by the reports from the individual states, it is to be surmised that from 40 to 50% of the industries will, in this way, be leased. But since these are the small industries which are to be let out, the reduction in the state community production will only amount to about 25%. Such changes as the permission to trade in the surplus products of the peasants, the freedom of industrial production of legal trade, and the letting of the small state industries mean a renewal of private economy, free trade, and in the long run, capitalism in Russia. It would be idiotic to deny this. Under the given circumstances, with the small number and the limited organizing capacity of the Russian proletariat, and with the isolation of the proletarian regime in the whole world, and the overwhelming peasant character of the country, a prolongation of the system of war communism would have led to the loss of our agriculture, to the return of the peasantry to a closed household, to an inability to feed the army and the industrial proletariat, and finally to the overthrow of the dictatorship. The tight grip of the central state control had to be loosened. The latter had to confine itself to those parts which it could actually control, and the remainder had to be reorganized according to changed circumstances. This made a third change necessary. Such larger industries as the mining industry, the railroads, and also foreign trade, which remained under the state economic control, had to be adapted to the actuality of an open market. The strict bureaucratic rules of state economic control had to be loosened. The industries were, from a commercial standpoint, organized into trusts which enjoy a greater freedom of management than they have had until now. In contrast to the system in use until now, these may satisfy certain needs directly in the open market and also place a part of their products on the market. The workers, as well as the directors, are interested in the prosperity of the undertaking by receiving part of the profits. In this way, these industries enter into competition in certain fields with the newly created private industries and with the big capitalistic enterprises, which are established on the basis of concessions, a competition for markets, for raw material and working power.
After this experiment in a crude form of communist production, the Bolsheviks were forced to roll back their changes and revert to using money to keep track of production, distribution, and consumption. Ultimately, this attempt to skip over the stage of capitalist development proved unsuccessful. Lenin was well aware of these concessions, something which I'm sure contributed to his declining health. Under a year after proposing the NEP, he said,
"If we take Moscow with its 4,700 communists in responsible positions, and we take that huge bureaucratic machine, that gigantic heap, we must ask, who is directing whom? I doubt very much whether it can truthfully be said that the communists are directing that heap. To tell the truth, they are not directing, they are being directed."
In spite of his triumphs and failures, Lenin stands betrayed by the official socialists of today, the ones who take the truth that Marxism and communism emerge from the real world as it exists and bastardize it to match their agenda. The concessions in Russia were necessary for the survival of the Soviet state and that survival alone. They also managed to provide a substantial strengthening of the efficacy of Marxist theory by presenting a real-life confirmation on the character of proletarian revolution. This is something most fools do not appreciate, instead regarding it as developmental for liberal reasons. They swear up and down that the course taken was an adaptation socialism had to make for its survival, that it could be and had been established in an isolated shithole. Leninism. This new adaptation of Marxism synthesized by Stalin shits on Lenin's contributions while wearing his face. It is also in direct contradiction with some of the earlier beliefs of Stalin himself, who originally and very clearly believed that the project was impossible. As Stalin so elegantly put in his original copy of Foundations of Leninism,
"The overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie and the establishment of a proletarian economy in one country does not yet guarantee the complete victory of socialism. The main task of socialism, the organization of socialist production, still lies ahead. Can this task be accomplished? Can the victory of socialism in one country be attained without the joint efforts of the proletariat of several advanced countries? No, this is impossible. For the final victory of socialism, for the organization of socialist production, the efforts of one country, particularly of such a peasant country as Russia, are insufficient."
This line could have easily been lifted directly from Marx, and strongly contrasts with his later opinions and those of his followers. The concept of socialism in one country has been irrelevant for as long as a communist revolution has been possible. Marx and Engels observed that capitalism is a global system, one which would interconnect everything, making one nation only one piece of the puzzle of the communist movement. Engels stated that,
"Will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? No. By creating the world market, big industry has already brought all the peoples of the earth into such close relation with one another that none is independent of what happens to the others. It follows that the communist revolution will not merely be a national phenomenon, but will take place simultaneously in all civilized countries. It is a universal revolution and will accordingly have a universal range."
Their words alone are not enough. Even if Marx and Engels had never made this analysis, history has proven it to be the case. Over the course of the 20th century, revolutions continued to sweep the peripheral world, all of which faced similar conditions to pre-Soviet Russia. The resulting revolutionary states were economically isolated and industrially lacking. This made them vulnerable and threatened to bring poverty and destitution. In similar vein to the Bolsheviks, all had to experiment with different methods of industrializing, all ultimately settling on commodity production. In spite of revolutionary ambition and aesthetic, all would become complacent with a socialism which bore striking resemblance to the capitalism they claimed to reject. Vietnam opened up a McDonald's, North Korea sells munitions to Russia, and China, well, China is clearly getting their money up. All countries are producing goods for profit, thus all countries are engaging in commodity production. The proletarian nature of this commodity production remains to be clear. In analyzing these examples of AES, we must remain ruthlessly critical of their nature and ask ourselves, who is directing whom?